So I'll give you the 30-second warning if that works. Okay, great. Thanks for joining us. And we'll get started in just a minute.
So what is your site about?
Yeah, things and accuracy.
And I'm just going to ask Wilton. I guess if people come in, we probably want them to go this way. Wilton, can I ask you a question? Yeah, he doesn't care. Should we go and get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. My name is Shahid Buttar. I'm with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, joined here by David Huerta and Nathan Sheard. We're excited to share a little time with you guys talking through a few digital security concepts and ideally some tools. We're also going to bridge the gap between defense and offense and turn the mic back to some of you to talk about what that looks like in practice. Just to get us started, I'll ask each of my co-facilitators just to introduce yourselves.
Cool. So I'm David Huerta. I'm a few different things. I help run the digital security privacy trainings called Crypto Parties around New York City. We've had, I think, by now, probably over 40 events across different communities. The Brooklyn Public Library is one of our kind of folks that we work with, among many other people, facilitators, etc. So definitely check us out, cryptoparty.in. I'm also a digital privacy fellow at the Freedom of Press Foundation, where I do even more digital privacy training, but specifically for journalists, documentary filmmakers of every kind of media outlet and size. So if you're a journalist kind of interested in digital security and what are some of the concerns out there, things to think about, definitely let me know.
Cryptoparty.in.
Yeah.
Thank you. Before I write down.
Oh, yeah.
Nash?
Yeah.
All right, so I am Nash, and my road to this room is kind of, I guess there are very few straight roads, right? I worked in the music industry for a number of years, and then started becoming more active politically, originally doing a lot of facilitation for different organizing spaces, and then getting into more direct action planning, and then figuring out that if I was going to be getting myself arrested and other people arrested, I had a responsibility to make sure they were taken care of. And so started doing a lot of legal organizing. I'm a member of Mutant Legal, which is a legal activist collective here in New York City. And from the work that I've been doing with Mutant Legal, I was asked to come out to Ferguson and help organize the legal support as they anticipated mass arrest when the officer was not indicted for killing Michael Brown, for the murder of Michael Brown. And subsequently came back the day before Daniel Pantaleo was not indicted for the murder of Barry Garner. And then was asked to come out to Baltimore and help build legal support after Freddie Gray was killed. And so in doing all of this and making sure that communities had the tools that they needed to be able to support each other in these moments of uprising and crisis, also becoming very aware that we were in making sure we had all the information and resources that we needed to be able to support folks in their fights, in their challenges against the legal system, that we had a responsibility to make sure that all of that information was kept really securely. And so a lot of our focus started becoming more and more aware of how are we going to make sure that people had the tools that they needed in the streets to challenge street level surveillance, but also that we had the tools and we're continuing to develop and reevaluate tools that would keep the information that we had secure, and really kind of being aware of the difference between real protections and legal protections. And so we could actually make sure that we weren't depending upon the police and other agencies to respect what people's privacy rights were, but actually we were keeping the information in ways that would prevent us from maybe even having to be in that space. So that's kind of how I kind of transitioned from being an activist, and I continue to evolve and grow in all of those spaces. But where the focus of my work has kind of moved from being in the streets and direct confrontation and direct organizing of immediate response to actually building some of the infrastructure to make sure that the work that people are doing in the streets is actually sustainable and can continue to be aware of the kinds of repression that they're going to be facing and being kind of proactive in the way that we look at that. So that's me. And so now I also work with Black Movement Law Project, which came out of the work that we did in Nicole Lee, who's an international human rights attorney, Abi Hassan, who at the time was the mass defense coordinator for the National Lawyers Guild, we were in Baltimore and kind of realizing, we'd all been through Ferguson, and we were now in Baltimore and realizing that whereas in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and a lot of the other places, there were those systems that existed. There was a really strong NLG. There was local organizing communities who had kind of like been through a lot of those situations and had the tools that they needed and resources that they needed to support their communities through their engagement with the legal system. A lot of mid-sized cities didn't have those skills, and we looked around the room and said, like, where are the other black attorneys and legal workers that are making sure that they're passing those skills on? And there wasn't really a wealth of them. There were some. And so we created a Black Movement Law Project, which really tries to make sure that we're creating the opportunity for Black-led spaces and sharing the skills and resources so that communities can support themselves in interaction with the legal system, right? It's very important that you need to be barred to be able to represent someone in court. You need to be barred to be able to give someone legal advice. But there's a wealth of things that communities can do to support themselves in their interaction and protection of other members of their communities and people that they want to support as they face those types of oppression. So that's what a lot of our work is. More recently, I've been working out in Standing Rock with the Freshit Collective, which is one of the two collectives that Freshit, F-R-E-S-H-E-T, I'll actually write it down. F-R-E-S-H-E-T, and their website is Freshit Collective.org. And there really I have been working in as opposed to like where being a black man who's been working and organizing in a lot of spaces in Ferguson, Baltimore that were like Black-led movements to push back on the murdering of Black and brown people. This is a space where I've really been working in. I don't want to like to say ally because I don't think that ally is a noun, right? But working to try to be in support of an indigenous-led movement and making sure that they also have the skills and resources that they need to protect themselves. The Freshit Collective, we're one of the two collectives that's working in North Dakota to provide legal support to people that were arrested in Standing Rock. We have over 700 arrestees facing a wealth of charges from federal to misdemeanors and what have you. So out there, that's been a lot of the work as well, trying to make sure that the attorneys and the legal workers and the organizers that are building that support have ways that they can share information without putting it at the risk, not just of state actors, but I don't know if folks saw the recent article from The Intercept about Tiger Swan and the other collaborations that have happened with companies that have been working in support of DAPL and the pipelines in order to infiltrate and weaken the resistance to those harms in our environment, right? So that's kind of my work. Do you want to take it over?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Nash. Thanks, David. And I'll ask, actually, if either of you want to write down any other links to organizations that have resources like Freedom of the Press, maybe would be a good one. And we'll add some links for you to check out. And each of these organizations will have resources available both to you and the organizations that you work with. A couple themes to tease out from our introductions. Nathan did a good job of explaining how technology and law can intersect in very interesting ways. For instance, we live in the United States, we have a First and a Fourth Amendment, right, that theoretically provide a right to, for instance, assembly, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, which would suggest, for instance, that your communications shouldn't be pervasively monitored by the government. But even where the law or policy fails to protect your rights, technology can give you means to recover them. And that's the context for our being here today. We know that you are not merely citizens of a republic with these rights in crisis, you are also organizers of social movements that are particularly in need of those rights. And so we hope that through some of the tools and concepts we're hoping to share with you over the next hour and a half, to put you and your organizations in a position to better recover, particularly your rights to speech, assembly, and the right to petition the government. As well as, for that matter, whatever else you might choose to use your right of assembly for, right? This isn't narrowly focused in the context of civic action. Privacy can be valuable for any number of things, but just to get us another concept to tease out, and then I'll turn it back to you all actually for the first of a series of small group exercises that we'll do. You might have heard, for instance, that there is in any number of spheres, a magic silver bullet, a thing you can do that then addresses a set of problems that you might be concerned about. And unfortunately, in digital security, there is no such thing. Another way to put that is that there is no app for that. There are lots of apps for lots of different things. But in order to be meaningfully engage in your own digital security, you have to have a sense of which tools to use when and for what purpose. And so the first of our things we're going to get into today is a series of exercises to help you tease that out for yourself. But just quick note with respect to logistics, because this session is being live streamed, the room is mic'd. And so we will ask you to do some small group discussions, but I just want you to be aware that it's not a private space. So just keep that in mind as you're sharing with your partners your thoughts with respect to the prompts that we'll share. If you're coming into the room and looking for a seat, there are some over here, and we'll break into small group discussions in a second, so that'll be an opportune time to move. First, just I'll ask everybody to look around the room for someone you did not come in with to have a one-on conversation with in a minute. The prompt for this conversation, we're going to come back to this person at least one or two more times in the next few minutes. So with this person, take a few minutes to introduce yourselves, share your name, share where you're coming from, share any organizations that you work with, and feel free to, again, take a couple minutes for this because we're going to come back to that person. But the nugget for this conversation, what we really want you to get at is why are you here right now and not in a different session? Something drew you to a session on digital security. Just take your first swipe at what that is, as general a layer as you like. Any further prompts to inform that exercise that you guys want to share?
That's a place to start.
Yeah, that's a good start.
So let's take, we'll take 5 or 10 minutes for this. So go ahead and turn to your neighbor, or if you made contact with someone across the room, go ahead and walk over. Are you looking, you need a partner still? I can be your partner. Do you need a partner, brother? Do you need a partner for the exercise? You're shooting. That's wonderful. I split up that group of 3 to partner one of them with So I would ask you about FTF things, but I know what Mike's still probably won't. Well, but as long as we're here, tell me about resistance. What's the latest? Is there anything public?
I mean, it's more like, I think all the people that were resistance members that were doing stuff as part of resistance kind of just basically joined like a lot of other groups that were already there. So there's 2 people I want to intro you to I'm going to do that today at the airport, but they've been kind of the 2 people that are like leading up a lot of that effort. Mostly in Prospect Heights, like kind of that area. Like, I see kind of a lot of local
workshops. I met some people, at least Crypto Squad. He's doing a thing BPL. Was that the same stuff?
No, it's a different group, but that's they rebranded to Cypher, which is great. I love that. Yeah. But more cats. But yeah, which is great because I think both like Matt and I, especially with that meetup group, we've just kind of been like so busy that we didn't want to deal with like creative, like we were still doing digital security trainings, we're still doing crypto parties.
Yes.
But it's just like such a chore to just deal with like kind of turning them out at the rates we were previously.
Yeah.
So it's nice to just like we were able to get Cypher to be like, hey, they were like, hey, we want to do a meetup and do things that way, but we can't afford the like fee or whatever. I'm like, well, we already have that subscription, so you should just like post it as one of our assets.
Nice.
So we were able to like do that way.
So you guys are collaborating. That's great.
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
Okay.
So we're helping them kind of have access to all our kind of more on the signal boosting part and just kind of letting them like handle things in their own style.
That's the sweet spot.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to do with the It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Share a resource, let them do it their own way.
Yep.
Good.
Yeah. So that's yay. So that's turning out pretty well. A lot of people seem to have pretty good feedback about their events, so
Nice.
I'm pretty excited about that.
Oh, and I met somebody else who works with you, someone from Phoenix, who's at a 2600 meetup group on Friday, started a hackerspace there with you. I have his card, I can't remember his name.
It may have been a few different people. There's a weird. So there's a there's like a diaspora of like Phoenix tech that kind of ended up like going all over the place.
Not just New York.
Some in New York, but like mostly in the Bay Area actually. But there are people like it may have been Chad or Jacob Rosenthal or
Jacob.
Yeah, Jacob. So he was like co-founder with Heatsink with me back in Phoenix, and he's a digital nomad, so he's just kind of all over the place.
That's what he told me. He broke down some fascinating things for me about ketosis.
Oh God.
No, but get it. So we're talking, and then at one point I'm like, well, so I'm just wondering why you do this, because you seem like you're in relatively decent shape. He said I was 330 pounds a couple years ago, and I was like, oh my God, It kind of blew my mind actually. And I'm fasting for Ramadan, so like his explanation of human biology was actually informative for my experience at the time. So I'm
cool.
synthesizing fat to get through the day.
Yeah.
This happened. Yeah, no, this was seemed like a fascinating cat, and he broke down his whole nomadic piece too. He doesn't particularly post up anywhere. That was awesome.
Yeah. So Jacob's an interesting character. He's a character. It's
I got that.
He's an interesting guy.
Hardware hacker. On the stage itself. You don't hear that very often. Anyway, okay, so then he said that the crypto squad was partnering with you guys, and that was helpful.
So it was great that they just kind of took off on their own and were able to just get off the ground running. Without necessarily that much help from us. It was just here's some pro tips, and here's free reign on our meetup, and if you want, we'll retweet anything you post.
I liked the way they ran their BPL workshop. I was only there for 20 minutes because I had to leave to go to the thing with Tammy and you that same day that we met. I didn't realize all those dots were connected.
Okay.
But they had separate breakouts, one for newbies, which was more directed, and then there was a table where people who had some experience could geek out and have their whatever their directed conversations were that didn't confuse the people who were new. That, I thought that was a very genius.
That's a good idea.
So that the newbies don't get intimidated by the questions that they don't even the answers to the questions they don't even understand.
It's a very fine line to walk. It's just making sure that you're not scaring the shit out of everybody. So
that seemed like a clever way to do it. Where it's okay, if you're new, here you go, and this will be a very basic conversation. But if you have any experience and you're here to ask a question and you're going to scare somebody off, come over here. And then it also seemed like that was much more peer-to-peer, and that all those people had experience and they were answering each other's questions, whereas the newbie table was a little more facilitating. Has Tammy reached out to you at all? Is she
Definitely. So I helped kind of do a very, very simple intro to what to think about as far as security goes.
Did people come to the stage?
Yeah. There were a lot of people. It was a very crowded room, actually. It was 25 people.
Nice.
I actually recognized a few people, so it was just oh hey, what's up?
Okay.
From unrelated contacts.
That's awesome.
And they were talking about doing a monthly thing.
Pardon me, are you going to have a panel?
We are doing a panel.
Please have a seat over this. We're sort of in the middle of it right now.
You're in the middle? Oh, okay.
But feel free to have
What are people doing?
there's a group exercise, and maybe we'll move you in on the next one.
So I've been talking about a monthly thing, which I think would be pretty useful, and I'd be down for a lot of that. So.
Great. There's also, it turns out in her neighborhood, I'm blanking on her last name, Sandy at Open Tech.
Oh, yeah.
Virginia, that's right. Yeah. So they're apparently in the same neighborhood.
Okay, cool.
I just connected them online, and so Sandy's another person you could,
definitely.
to whatever extent it's overwhelming her. But that's awesome. I'm glad they're doing something monthly. Our pitch to her was just go public so we can amplify your stuff. Still have an interest in doing it everywhere. It's probably a good time to maybe ask people to wrap up there. So go ahead and take just another minute or two, and then we'll come back together.
They should be
And make sure that both people have had a chance to exchange. This is probably the most camera-fied session I've seen since I've been here.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some interest in just like having this sort of thing available online.
Yeah.
Mostly, it's not an ideal format because you can't ask a YouTube question or you ask a YouTube video question. But it's just one of those things where like everything that's out there either gets outdated so quickly, or is all like very cyber bro and kind of just like lead hacks bro.
And I fear that this won't necessarily be ideal because like use cases would be organized, but still I think that it's useful to have anything like that. I fear the danger of people getting these kinds of sessions and doing it and thinking they're moving forward security when they're like not necessarily adopting tools.
Right.
If you can hear me, clap once. You can hear me, clap twice. You can hear me, clap 3 times. Thank you for playing. All right. So, did any interesting observations emerge for you in the context of that exercise? And again, I'm just going to remind you that the room is mic'd, so please feel free to abstract or anonymize any reflections you choose to share.
Please speak up to
But did anybody learn something from a partner that was interesting to you? Yeah.
I guess what emerged for me was part of the reason why I'm here is because I don't even have the language to talk about this stuff, and so that's part of what I wanted to get. And when I was asking Nash about like programming, and because I was talking to Marshall and he's a programmer, and so you were saying that you are the kind of go-between because of the lack of language between, like, say, just somebody who's out in the streets and then an actual programmer. It's totally different world. So
Yeah. If I can elaborate.
Please, yeah.
So yeah, the conversation we were just having is that like kind of over the last years where my work has kind of evolved into is that I work with a lot of like folks that are like really great programmers in like PHP and Python and do a lot of amazing work. But a lot of the times they're wondering like, how can I support movement work, right? And then there's like folks who are like the folks who are actually the ones who are using and need a lot of these tools to be able to support them. And sometimes it's difficult for the two groups to have the conversations, right? Because they're talking and they're not using the same language, the same words, and understanding a lot. So it ends up being a lot of the space that I hold in a lot of the organizing spaces that I'm in, and like building and like understanding and knowing and interacting with folks who have direct needs to support the work that they're doing in the street, and translating that and vice versa to like, here's the people who can organize them, and like, is this a thing that can be done, and what tools would be able to do that, and how can we make sure we're having those conversations in effective ways. And actually that's how movement.tools actually came out of a conversation that we had recently at the Internet Freedom Festival, where there were a bunch of programmers who really wanted to be able to support movement work more and know how. There were folks who had responded during the after Trump gave his executive orders, and there was like a real need at JFK for technologists to help support the attorneys that had rushed out there to make sure that people weren't being harassed, that they weren't being deported, that they weren't being detained. And people were like, oh, but there's this thing that exists on GitHub, and I'm like, yeah, but the majority of organizers are not going to be on GitHub, like that's not, so if you're trying to find the place where those two groups can meet and find out how to collab and support each other, let's try and find tools that are actually more welcoming to both of those groups, but also where technologists can collab on tools that they're building, but also organizers who are not as technically savvy can say, this is a thing that we need, and is there someone that can help us do that? So that's actually why we created movement.tools. So definitely check that out. But yeah, so like that is a lot of the time the role that I end up playing is like the creating and supporting the bridges, let's say.
the translator.
Yeah.
And welcome to the space. We do hope to arm you with some of that language. And in fact, in the next segment, we're going to start doing that, and we're going to turn you back with the next phase of language to try to get into that a little bit. Did you want to share anything in response to that, or unpack devices versus data versus communications, any of that?
Yeah, actually kind of building on what you were saying, what are some of the tools that are needed out there? Because it seems like the thing that I keep running into is software developers, programmers that want to build like yet another end-to-end encrypted messaging app, and then everybody else being like, we really, 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 really want an encrypted Google Drive without the Google part, and a calendaring system that's also secure. which seems to be like a missing thing in the space. So I was curious to see if you had any other.
Well, there are tons of things. We need lots and lots of things.
Yeah.
So like some of the things that we've been working on is like what are ways to, and it's funny because another reason for new movement tools is because there are a bunch of technologists that are working on these things in separate spaces and not realizing that, hey, like the tool kind of exists, or if we work together, we could like build a better thing. And so that was also another reason for that. It's like folks, because there were the folks like we, and ever since I think Occupy Oakland, there's been this tool called Memory Hole, which is like basically a modified CRM that we use for tracking people once they've been arrested, making sure that they have the support and that they're connected with attorneys.
What's the CRM?
CRM, oh, Client Resource Manager. So essentially, it's based off of Sugar CRM, which is like a basic like client resource manager that companies use to track their clients, but it's been modified so that it's useful for attorneys and legal organizers to track arrestees and evidence and connect different evidence with the list of people and what have you. But this Sugar CRM is now proprietary, so some of the patches and things are hard to do, and it's also very difficult to deploy. And so if you don't have a local technologist that writes in PHP, then like how do you make it accessible for your community? And so those are a lot of the challenges that we're dealing with. And so while we've been working on that, the folks who had responded to JFK were building something brand new because they didn't know that existed, right? And so luckily we were able to connect actually at IFF and be like, hey, this thing exists, and how do we like support each other's work? So yeah, so any technology that's going to allow for folks to be able to more effectively track people from the time they're arrested throughout their but really, and as much as folks that want to support like looking at what it's on GitHub I can send it to you. No, I can write it on the board before the end of the session here. And if folks want to help develop that out and kind of help us move that would be great. Ways that, if you look at the situation of Ramsey Orta, you look at the situation of Ramsey Orta and Kevin Moore, who Ramsey Orta filmed the killing of Eric Garner. Kevin Moore filmed the killing of Freddie Gray. And both of them have subsequently, Ramsey serving time right now, right? And so both of them have received a significant amount of retribution at the hands of the police, right? So the more that we can also develop tools that will allow for people who have filmed police misconduct to be able to submit that documentation to an organization anonymously, so that to make that information available as needed,
and still retain access.
Because those
apps exist, but the ones you might have heard about don't necessarily give the people who submit footage through them continuing access to the footage. But before we chase this rabbit, and before we talk too much about tools that need to be developed, can I just get a show of hands of anybody who might be at all confused by some of the language that we're using? Yeah, so I want not to race past you. So let's just take a few steps back, and maybe to the point you raised, I want to differentiate between a few different categories of things that you might protect. And we're going to ask you then to redo the exercise and talk again about why you are here. So you might be here because you want to protect communications, or perhaps to guard anonymity in communications, right? Perhaps the thing that you're communicating about is something sensitive, for instance, something that might expose someone to arrest, and so you want for those communications not to be transparent to law enforcement, let's say, or private sector surveillance by the oil company or the fracking company whose activities you might be protesting. That's one appropriate concern, communications security, and you could separate that into the contents of the communications, or also perhaps merely the identity of who you're communicating with is itself sensitive, in which case you have to protect not only the communications content, but the metadata too. Metadata being, you could think of it as roughly like the information on the outside of the envelope, right? Sometimes you just have to protect what's in the envelope, but sometimes you need to protect the outside too, right? And so those require different sets of tools. Sometimes it's not communications that you might be concerned about, but rather data. And then that raises the question, is it data that you hold on a device in your home or office, or is it data in the cloud? Those have different tools. And we just mentioned devices. That's a whole other set of issues. Is the device that you carry around in your pocket the locus of your particular insecurity, right? And we can talk a little bit about that. There's a similar conversation we'll have about who you want to protect these things from, but for now, just focus on the things. What do you have that is sensitive? And a couple things to think about here. It might not be something of your own. It might be something of someone else's that is sensitive to them. And so in this respect, this starts to illuminate how security is a team sport. especially when you work very closely with people, the weakest link in the chain sets how secure is the network. And you can make choices for yourself, and I make choices for myself frequently that, leave me being transparent. When I'm working with other people or when I'm wearing my EFF hat, I have to default to a much higher mode of secrecy and security. So with that, I'm going to ask anything else to add to the exercise that you guys want to share, just with that piece? Yeah. So go ahead and go back to your partners, take another couple minutes, and dig through what is it that you have. And again, be one layer abstract because you don't want to reveal anything especially sensitive in the room because the room is not itself secure. But feel free to, with your partner, have this conversation, and I would love for you, to the extent you can, drill down into these particular categories: devices, communications, and data. And then come out of this conversation, to the extent you can, with a sense of what you're here for, and we'll start. I hate to use the word triangulation now. I feel like it's been poisoned. But we'll start to triangulate your precise needs by assessing your threat vectors after this. Yeah, there's an open ally over here who needs a partner. Do you guys want to work together? Right here? Great.
That's so sweet. My aunt is here.
Your aunt?
My aunt in the pink shirt up there. I looked up there. I was like, oh.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
That's awesome. Nice. Awesome. I know you guys are relatively new to each other. It sounded like there was just that one session you've been in before. I mean, we can't all hang out over lunch. You guys can both go to lunch. Okay, so we'll have more time together.
Yeah, cool.
I was gonna have you talk to each other now, but we'll do that.
Yeah.
Plenty of time for that.
Yeah. No, it'll be good. Thanks for reeling it back in.
I'm always concerned about leaving people behind.
Yeah. No. Hell yeah.
I do always though, in case of, especially if it's live streamed and a developer in the internet is watching it, I kind of just want to drill home.
Sure
That's my PSA to bring developers into this space of just being by the way, maybe don't do the messenger app. Maybe do these other things on our wish list instead.
You got literally 10,000 people developing something responsive to a news cycle that they're all reading. No, no one is developing any of these things. Yeah.
Nope.
No, I thought that got the point across. Yeah.
Cool.
How long are you in town, Chad?
Just till tomorrow, Monday night, tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night?
Yeah, it's a quick trip. I got in Thursday.
Oh, cool.
There's that 2600 meetup that happens on the first Friday, I think, of every month.
Oh, I didn't know about it.
I hadn't, until, who told me about it? I think it was Theo, the New York City privacy advocates. Those folks told me about it, so I went there just to schmooze, meet people, and then connected. There's a couple groups I met. DEF CON 201 is a New Jersey network of white hat hackers, I gather, and they have networks across the city. We happened to randomly get a call from an elected city council person in Jersey City who's working with us on a surveillance reform bill.
Oh, cool.
Super psyched about it, and it'll be much stronger than the New York one, but what we didn't have was any constituents who were public, so I think on Friday we picked them up, so that was exciting.
Yeah.
And then, that former collaborator of David's, who's active in a lot of different places, including Phoenix, where he's from, so that was kind of cool. And then just met a bunch of the New York people. I wasn't sure if Theo's group had a bear there, what the base was, but I met at least half a dozen people who've been working with him, including some diverse organizers, people from different backgrounds. Yeah, cool. So I was impressed with that. I mean, that might have been my overarching takeaway, is that this group that I'd heard of and seen reflections of actually does have a base. They've been seeking support from some of the other EFA groups in town, but not necessarily targeting their outreach. And I've been saying that you got to show up at people's meetings to make a pitch. You can't post to a listserv and expect somebody to do anything.
No, that's right.
So that's been my so far pretty much.
That was my during camp the legal to be well, we have open office hours, so how come people don't come? I'm you have to find people where they're at, yo. It's we exist, come see us.
That's something that I love when Matt's around, because he gets into the barbershop outreach track. I feel that's so powerful and important for people to understand. Not even about digital security, just organizing. Go find your folks.
Definitely. Yeah, he's out in the world doing amazing things.
I think he's international at the moment. Right?
Yeah. I spoke to him the other day because we're looking to find someone to do I think I've been saved.
That's good.
We're looking for some things, and he knows a lot of things, and yeah.
Good.
He's good.
All right, make sure that each person in your group is having a chance to share.
I think so.
I see a couple people silent, but I think it's because they're like partners or yeah. So it seems like
Oh yeah.
let's do a time check.
I think they're good.
So yeah. Do either of you guys? You haven't had a chance to talk much. Would you want to talk about the threat landscape? Would you feel comfortable?
I think so. Yeah, because that's something I've been doing a little bit more of, and just like kind of going into like, it's not just your government, it's not just the NSA, but luckily like 2FA is great and can mitigate a lot of problems. So even though if it seems overwhelming, there's so much out there. It just happens to be that like a huge chunk of it can be like deterred pretty effectively with some simple steps.
Yeah, I would hope maybe as we're doing the threat landscape not to distract people with tools just yet. We'll get to that, but the things that I tend to.
What I figure I'll do is just go to twofactor.org or just like have it added and just be like, check this out.
Yeah. So could we just hold that until, because my theory would be if we did the threat landscape and then have them do this again.
Okay.
So they're defining digital assets. Now
So you're like, what are your assets? Who are your adversaries?
Right. And so, but here I just want them to think, so it's NSA obviously that's what everybody thinks about, and then foreign intelligence. But then like, who does 2FA protect you from? It's criminal hackers. It's the phishers.
It's also like political groups. Like there's like alt-right groups that are like much more
totally
like offense security savvy, and that's just like becoming more of a problem.
And then where I try to make people think, like stretch their thinking is like threat vectors within families. So like yes, it's international actors. Yes, it's the local police. Yes, it's criminal hackers and these private corporations that want to squelch your voice. And, if you're in a DV situation, it might be your family, or like just that idea that threats can be from lots of different places. And to get them thinking creatively about who they want to protect their stuff from. That's my only goal in the threat landscape is just like whoever you think your threats are, there are more. But I think beating out of that initial thing is great because you're right that it knocks out so many of those threats. I do think it's useful not to terrify people too much by the end, but I like to terrify them in the middle.
That's wise.
It increases the learning. So that's probably.
Just got to make sure, like hopefully, like some realistic hope, right? Like
false hope is a bad idea.
Yeah.
That's my challenge with so much of this. Is like, you're right that a lot of the tools deal with so many of the threats, but the threats at the top of the food chain. I mean, still, quite frankly, I get and understand how some tools can run Tor on tails if you want to be hyper secure and deal with even those top threats. But like short of that. Top threats, you have to turn the dial up to a pretty inconvenient setting to deal with that.
I mean, the way I usually talk about it is like, Snowden was able to do this. Snowden had like CIA training, and it takes years of Snowdeniness of Snowden skills to like practice to actually be able to pull off something like that. And normally that's around but like that's not even most of the threat actors that are out there.
Right. Most people don't even need to worry.
And then we'll usually go into an example of just like even things like the more kind of examples that I have from the Press Foundation. I guess they're BV and SVA. They're a little bit older, but like basically the Syrian Electronic Army, which just went on this like media hacking spree like every like so.
Please come join us. Come on in. Come on in. There's a bunch of seats over here. We're just doing right now group discussions about what digital assets people want to protect. But come on and have a seat. We'll catch you up. So should we go and pull people back?
Yeah. I think so.
So if you can hear me, clap once. You hear me, clap twice. Don't even need to get to 3 times this time. All right. So any interesting learnings come out of that set of conversations? Hopefully folks are able to drill a little bit closer down on what is the thing that you're each trying to protect. So just to map that to the language of cybersecurity, you've been discussing your digital assets, and David's going to share with us a little bit about the landscape of potential threats that you might have to consider from which to protect those assets, and then we'll move into that phase of the conversation. David?
So I think with a lot of these kind of discussions, there's a lot of kind of the cool, big, scary, things that we hear a lot about. There's, a lot of three-letter agencies and a lot of cutely named companies in the other side of the coast of the country. There's more than that, I want to say, and some of these are also things to think about, but are not discussed as much. So at the Freedom Press Foundation, for example, we deal with people kind of facing a lot of different kind of threats, ranging from individual writers being threatened by online harassment groups like Gamergate or like alt-right groups, which has become more of an emergent phenomenon that's become a problem, and even kind of news outlets that are a little more established, but because they have a large audience, are also the attack of all the other countries' intelligence agencies. I think there was like a common trend of I think 3 years ago, the Syrian Electronic Army hacking into a bunch of American media companies, which you can read all about online and how that happens. So these are other things to take into account. There's also things like automated attacks. So, people ask themselves the question of who would ever want to attack me? I'm not anybody special. But it's one of those things where it's not necessarily a human decision-making process. Sometimes these attacks are very automated. This actually happened to me when I was working for a museum, and we had an automated botnet attack just trawl through lists of websites out in the universe and just be like, hey, this one's running something outdated. We can, hack into that and then, paste our stuff on their website. And there's no committee, there's no decision-making process, there's no FBI agent and giving anybody the green light involved. This is just literally code that's just running somewhere, and it's just being well, I just want to automatically have my stuff out there in as many hacked sites as possible without any particular determination as to where it ends up. And because of that, it's important to kind of frame a question of why would anybody have interest in me, and kind of changing that from being the assumption that this is a human on the other side to I don't know what is on the other side, so let's just take as many precautionary steps as we can. And there are many things that we can do that are actually quite simple that can cover a lot of that ground, even if they don't necessarily protect against the really, really hardcore threat models of the NSA, the FBI, and kind of all these Snowden level kind of sophisticated attack actors.
Maybe just one thing to add in there with respect to when David was talking about the Free Syrian Army. In the 90s, I was recruited by the State Department to serve as a diplomat, and so along with millions of other Americans, I went through a security clearance process. I think it was 2012, the Chinese OPM hack. When was that? 2013?
Oh, yeah.
Sometime in the last several years, I got a letter from the Office of Personnel Management in Washington, D.C., saying that, along with millions of Americans who've applied for security clearance, basically every place I had ever lived as of 1999 when I applied to state, every place I'd worked, my close friends, everything I'd shared with the government was in the hands of the Chinese government, because for 6 months, Chinese state intelligence agencies were able to infiltrate the Office of Personnel Management and steal everything from the home addresses of CIA agents to everything else that went through the security. And think of it this way, if the US federal government can't keep the home addresses of CIA agents safe from the Chinese intelligence agencies, there's no reason to think, quite frankly, that anybody can keep anything secure from anyone. But the point to grip there is that you have to take tools that OPM didn't. OPM wasn't using the security culture that is available even to you, even if you might feel relatively unsophisticated relative to a government agency. There are apps to, if you can define with enough specificity what you want to protect from whom, to lock it down. Other kinds of threats, we've talked a little bit about domestic agencies and foreign agencies. David mentioned cutely named companies on the other side of the country, which is it's a clever way of noting there is an industry in facilitating surveillance, and there is an industry. There are many industries in facilitating surveillance. Some of them, is social media companies. I will note One of them in particular, Facebook recently made a public decision to deny access to its API data to companies that are surveillance contractors. An interesting example of an effort from within Silicon Valley to guard its garden from intervention by state actors. But one thing we want to get you to think about as you consider the threats from which to protect your digital assets is beyond state actors. And certainly beyond federal actors. If you live in New York City, one of the principal agents of mass surveillance here is the NYPD. Local police increasingly effectuate mass surveillance through a whole litany of mechanisms. They might not be trolling your email account in the same way that, for instance, the NSA at one point in time was, and certainly might yet again. But the NYPD has tools that, for instance, monitor cell phone networks. There are tools that track location data in real time and historically using your license plates to identify you. And even outside of state and local governments, think about your employer as think about. I want to go back and do this in 90 seconds. This is going to take longer to do this though. I think this is worthwhile. Shut me up if this gets uninteresting. But so, can I just feel free to just chime back. Why is privacy important to you? We asked the question before why you're here, and we went to digital assets. There's a more abstract way of answering that question, which is to say, why is privacy meaningful? If anybody remembers, but yeah, please.
Just to me, just the feeling safe about freedom of expression.
Yes, you nailed it. People think about privacy as a thing unto itself. Privacy is the key to your freedom of expression. So even if you don't care if your neighbors see you naked, if you care about your or your neighbor's freedom of expression, you have to care about privacy. It is the crux to democracy. Without it, we lose speech, or at least the freedom to use it, right? And so when you think about surveillance undermining something, don't think of privacy as the thing surveillance undermines. What surveillance undermines is your capacity or your neighbor's ability to raise their voice. It is democracy that surveillance kills, not just privacy. And why am I saying this? Right, because what other kinds of threat vectors chill your expression? Employers can be one of the principal ones, right? That's not a state agency. That's not, just as David's saying, there's no process, there's no paper trail. Your employer isn't necessarily deciding to silence you. But if you work for one that might not agree with what your personal convictions are, it might just silence you on its own, right? Think even more expansively. What about not your present employer, but your potential future employers? This is a big deal for students right now, right, who are trapped in this sort of like cycle of debt. They want to get jobs. They want to preserve their future opportunities to gain employment. And so what does that lead them to? Tensions between either raising their voices and risking their future employment, or opportunities to use these kinds of tools to then protect your voice, right? And then one last set of threats. Does anybody want to talk about intra-family observation?
I think that, certainly, so there's always, I think what Shahid's getting to a lot is there are many different types of adversaries. It's not always the big bad letters, right? And so within families, it might even be situations of domestic violence, right, or other types of interfamily conflict, right? And those are going to be, what are they willing to do to get it? Those are going to be very different, and maybe even in some cases even more challenging things to stop than even with a state. The person who lives in my home is probably going to have much easier access to my device, right, to my actual physical device, than some of these other more complicated, more sophisticated actors, right? So what are the things that they're willing to do to get it, or what are the things that they're likely to do to get it, right? And what are the things that I can do to prevent that as well?
So all these kinds of things we're throwing at you, not just to terrify you, but to help you think creatively about, you've done some thinking about what you want to protect, right? So now just think creatively about who wants it, and that, or could want it, getting to David's point about automated hacking in particular, which I think was really important to grip. You think about your threat vectors, and then that will guide, in the next phase, we're going to talk through at least a few tools that you can use to start down the road of ensuring your digital security and privacy. It is a long road. And unfortunately, while there is an app for that, there's an app for about everything. So you have to figure out what is the thing you need in order to figure out from the constellation which star are you going to pluck, right? So questions on the next phase of the exercise. You've heard about domestic national security level surveillance, foreign government surveillance, local law enforcement surveillance, private sector surveillance, employer-based surveillance, and intra-family surveillance or observation monitoring, any of those things. I want thought in the back.
Yeah, I have like hours and hours of response for you, but the thing is, first and foremost, I have to ask about
Speak up.
PLA unit 61398 from China. They were caught, I think, 2 years ago, doing massive destruction, and it was a covert operation from the Chinese, this particular military unit. And when they were caught, the Obama administration did absolutely nothing about it. And I believe it to be an act of war when you have a military unit attacking us. I do believe, I have the sense that the PLA 61398 is back in action simply because they were empowered by the fact they got away with it and got a pass. And massive amount of information from the CIA and the NSA is beginning to get revealed. And I think massive amount of American information is out on the market either for sale by China or it's out for free by China, and it's being released either. Does anybody have a sense of that China is screwing us?
I mean, we haven't seen too much, but that only means that they're really. It could just mean that, like, if somebody doesn't get caught doing something, it doesn't mean it's not happening. So China is very sophisticated in its, what I guess in the industry we would call it, cyber capabilities, and that's become a trend that was not original to China. Like, the U.S. is also kind of taking that approach to a lot of its offensive capabilities with things like Stuxnet in Iran, for example. Russia, of course, has done this a lot, especially in terms of trying to use the limited capabilities that it has. Like, they can't look into our Gmail because that's a Californian company, but they can like try to trick us into giving us their Gmail passwords, which they did quite effectively in some cases. So that China's hacking, Russia's hacking, the U.S. is hacking, everybody's hacking. There's a lot of frameworks.
All the more need to embrace these tools. Yeah.
If you want to go into the nitty-gritty of law around this, there's the Talon Treaty is an interesting kind of document surrounding like the international laws around cyber attacks. That's I think co-drafted by NATO and I think some other groups. So.
And it might be jumping ahead too far, so I won't go too far down this line. But I think that what it really brings up is it's possible, right? But actually, it doesn't. No matter which actor it is, we still need the same protections, right? And which is also like this is the line. I don't want to go down too far, but it also is one of the reasons that we need to continue to advocate so strongly for like the government for the agencies which are trying to fight against like forms of encryption, that are trying to make sure there's backdoors included, because those same backdoors, those same limits on encryption are going to stop no matter what actor it is, right? Are going to create opportunities for any actor, right? Whether it be the Chinese government, the U.S. government, or any other red, black hat, gray hat person, actor that's out there. So,
and we're going to come back to that and just that theme that Nash is raising about how to fight back on government policies addressing these issues. We're going to come back to that in about half an hour.
I'm wondering if it's useful for the audience to make it clear the general ways that people get attacked. I think it falls into the following categories. There's physical access. Someone has access to your cell phone, someone has access to your computer. It's incredibly hard to protect it unless the computer's off and you do something.
Encryption. Yeah.
There's trickery. You get an email that looks like it's from Google and it's not, or it looks like it's from your employer, it's not. There are backdoors where the person developing it deliberately put in something to enable them to have access that you as the user don't expect. There's legal. FBI shows up with a court order and you don't feel like going to jail, so you give them access when the user again doesn't know. And probably the biggest category is just bugs, where computer software is incredibly difficult. It has dozens and dozens of layers, and if any one of those layers has a bug in it, people can access information. So my first question is, are there other categories, and like how do we educate population that at the first level there are these basic ways to have access?
I would say that there's as many kind of routes to exploiting security as the human creativity can come up with, but for most part you don't need much creativity. I would say, like, out of all those things, like, overwhelmingly the second one, the, like, fake login page, is probably the phishing attack, as we would say in the parlance of the information security industry, is probably the most popular and most effective attack vector. Not just for, and it sounds like a really simple thing, like, here's a fake web page, and that's what, folks that are trying to, get into people's information when their information's in another country have to resort to, which is why, this is a favorite attack with, the Russian FSB, for example, as we know from, like, the Podesta attack, among other things. But also a bunch of other groups as well, like that. And in journalism, we see that kind of common thing a lot. And not just in journalism, other industries too, but I just happen to be kind of in the, in that world. So that is probably like the biggest thing to worry about, because it's so much because everybody's doing it. So it's just like one of those things where, like, yeah, you can, like, go full Snowden and learn, like, all the cool Snowden stuff that Snowden knows, and be able to, like, pull off, all these stunts that, like, evade the radar of even the most powerful intelligence agencies. But if that's, like, this much of your concerns in attack space versus, like, everybody's doing a phishing attack and it's this much, if you can solve that chunk, that covers a lot of ground.
The other thing I'll add to that is one of the terms that people throw around is authentication, but that's exactly what you're talking about. How do I know that the person asking me for something, that the person I'm talking to, is who they claim they are?
Yeah,
So
we're
it's
going to
not
get
just-
to a lot of that in just a minute. You're right.
You authenticate to the computer, but also how do we, as we're doing things, know that it's not an agent pretending to be the person? How do we know you're talking to a journalist as opposed to someone pretending to be a journalist? How do you know that when someone texts you and says, meet me around the corner, that it really is your friend?
These are principles to keep in mind. We're going to come back to some of the tools just after we get through this last exercise. I think 2 more questions. You had a question, right? Do you have a question?
The document that you were talking about, how do you, Talon?
Oh yeah, the Talon Treaty. That's a giant book. It's
Oh,
it's available from, I think, MIT Press.
okay.
Don't think of it as an applied tool.
It's not an applied to. It's just like if you have, like, a bout of insomnia and you just want a book to put you to sleep, read the Talon Treaty.
Or you need an extra, like, PhD dissertation to keep yourself busy for 5 or 6
Yeah.
Let's see that.
Where does it fit in? Like, I think our revelations of what is happening kind of have come swift. So we're in the space of this threat modeling, these discussions. Do we have to imagine things that are possibly existing that we don't know about in our threat modeling? Does that make sense? Like,
Yes.
what can go on in the next 2 or 3 years, especially when you discuss protecting yourself from all these other kind of future causes?
I want to particularly come back to that when we hit the offensive space, because and here's why. We have an answer in the offensive discussion for that. In the defensive space, quite frankly, I don't. Right? I mean, I could claim that we do, and I'm sure that there are some very smart people thinking about it, but the fact of the matter is you were pressing on the soft spot in the sort of, like, digital security equation, which is to say it is an active arms race in which, as David was describing, there are any number of participants. So, like, if you get the sense from this that technology is essentially the Wild West, you should. It's worth noting it did not need to be this way, and it does not need to be this way, but as long as the government and the regulatory bodies and the companies sort of insist on a paradigm that is inherently insecure, sort of it behooves you to proactively engage these tools. You're absolutely right to note that the landscape of threats will expand in the future, so will the responsive tools. So while we are confident that new threats will emerge, we're also quite confident that new tools will emerge, precisely because of that same community that David and Nash were talking about in the sort of active discourse. There is a very vibrant hive of people around the world who are on your side in that very same arms race. Does anybody want to say any more on that, please? White hats or...
I mean, I would say that there's a few different people working on security things. I think security was an issue that was not really taken seriously for the longest time, or, like, thought of as, like, a very, like, paranoid concern. But I think as we're seeing more and more of, more and more people realize that, like, the people out to get them are also now coming on board with cyber capabilities, as we would say. that's become more of like, oh, maybe I do need to think about this. I do need to think about, like, now. It used to be, I thought it was just like some dude in mirror shades, with, it was just, but no, it's actually it's Syria, it's Russia. Oh no! So now it's suddenly a concern for a lot of people, and so in addition to kind of like the kind of grassroots work that a lot of us kind of in that space as developers do to like create better tools to protect individuals, there's probably also going to be like realistically a lot of improvements in concern and investment into security happening in the services that we already use, hopefully.
It's always funny to me though, because because so much of my work is in a domestic context, and like with state agents being one of the, when I look at who wants to get this and what would happen if they got a state agents being a thing that I'm constantly aware of, as well as like non-state agents. But then like them starting to work with more folks who deal with like international human rights and civil society context, and realizing how much the U.S., because of like wanting to hold a space within the context of how civil resistance is working in other cultures, how much of that is actually like pushed by the U.S. State Department, and like building the tools is actually created by our State Department in an attempt to make sure that they hold a certain space in the way that those conflicts are resolved and the forms of resistance that exist in other political contexts, right?
I'm not sure if this is quite what you've ever one way I'm taking that. I think it's safe to say, and I've heard this from senior cybersecurity professionals in the United States, that what this arms race that we were talking about, we fired first. Right? And when I say we, I mean to say the three-letter agencies in Washington and Fort Meade that supposedly keep you safe, they made the internet insecure for all of us. And so now you were engaged in an effort to try to reclaim some of that. I get that maybe there's some pushback, and let's have a debate later. But I do want to get you guys talking about your threats. So like we can have an abstract discussion, but I want to move this forward. Is this quick?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So were you saying that some of the tools that you're using domestically were actually...
Well, yeah, it's both sides. We fired first, but we've also been building the shields because, like, so for instance, like Signal, for its Open Whisper Systems, was funded by OTF, which is funded by the State Department, right? Tor, which originally funded by the Department of the Navy, in order to protect and to anonymize their agents in other spaces. So we've kind of like the U.S. has been playing this weird role in like creating the weapons and the defense at the same time so that they hold the space, and so it's just interesting in like dealing with the international context.
They call it constructive chaos. No, it's Bush calls it. The destruction of the Middle East Bush called it constructive chaos, which is he funded Iran, Iraq, the Jews, Syria. Assad was a criminal under Nixon. But then when he started saying he wanted to do this, we didn't like him anymore. It's called constructive chaos, and it's a way Hitler called it storm and stress. You cause the chaos, then you say you got the cure. War. And the fact of demonizing Asia or Syria or somebody else for hacking, when NSA, supposedly there was a war in the Middle East, and NSA, 800,000 private contractors had access of every American's private knowledge. And the primary company was a Saudi Arabian company. But yet, we're hacking globally. Barclays, we're attacking England's media, Jazeera, we're attacking Russia, destabilizing Russia, Operation Ivy Bells. Destabilizing our movements, Operation Able.
Okay.
Let's not badmouth Asia and the Middle East when we have our own hacking issues, this country. Our own surveillance issues, this country as a movement.
So how
we've got to protect our movement.
So I think it's a good point in that again, that brings back to the point that the same ways that we're going to protect ourselves from actors, no matter where they are and what their motivations are. So each individual, whether it be us or the people that we're responsible for, that we're taking back the control in how our information is managed and dealt with, right? And so who the actor is less important as how we're able to protect ourselves from those situations.
That's good. Shahid? Yeah, thank you, Nash. So I see a couple more questions. With your permission, I just want to ask you to hold them for a minute because I do want to get us into some of the tools. We're having a sort of abstract discussion about a lot of concepts, but I want to make sure that you leave here with things you can use, and we do need to kind of move along to get there. Having said that, do any of you still want to pose your questions? We can just take them both, and maybe we won't respond to them necessarily.
One sentence. Are you also going to be talking about how to combat government secrecy?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, just really quick. I think that fight back and to protect ourselves from unsecure technologies is not only a thing about at the consumer level, but also at the production level.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that capitalist production in software and hardware is the main source of unsecure technology. I also feel that the imperialists, especially the US imperialism, is the source of that unsecure technology. It's not only that multiple actors are around hacking other people, but it has to be kept in mind that the one who monitors the internet at the tower level, at the international waters, are the NSA. It's not Syria, it's not just the Chinese, it's the USA. So I think
Absolutely.
For now.
Yeah, for now. I mean, we have had a historical role in creating the insecurity in the internet. I absolutely want to make that clear. And when you might have seen in the panel description that this is about digital security, defense, meta defense, and offense. Offense is what we were talking about there, and meta defense and offense starts to cross this, because part of our goal here is not only to acquaint you with the state of affairs on the internet, right? You might log into walled gardens and it seems like a safe place, but in fact it's this arena that is sort of like a knife fight in, the background. And you're absolutely right to just describe the historical role of U.S. intelligence agencies in ensuring that current state of affairs. I'd like to put you all in a position to do what you can, though, to still deal with it in a way that protects your rights. And maybe the last thing I'll just say with respect to your point about two things. You're absolutely right about the role of the profit incentive for companies that are involved in creating certain sets of platforms. I'm thinking particularly about social media companies and their advertising revenue. Corporate surveillance through social media platforms is a threat vector, and it's one that's particularly compelled by the business model. Free and open software. Has anybody heard of the free software movement or open source software? Sure. So they're not exactly the same thing, but those are ways that people develop, for instance, the kinds of tools to defend your security or any number of other things through a non-corporate alternative. There is a robust, vibrant community around the world of free and open software developers. If you're interested in technology and share that critique, look at the free software movement, because that's a channel through which you can contribute your skills, your vision, your expertise, and support humanity, instead of trying to line somebody's pocket. And I think you're absolutely right that that's been a central feature, unfortunately, of the technology landscape, is that it has been largely developed for profit. But I would just note also that for people whose experience with technology is mostly with for-profit platforms, explore as a user the very wide range of available free and open software that you can use. You don't have to use Facebook, right? There are free and open software social media alternatives, right? Even the things that are some of the most pernicious threats to your privacy, there are free and open software equivalents. So whether as a developer or whether as a user, explore that arena, please. And thank you for introducing that piece to the conversation.
Could I just put the URL on the board?
Please, feel free. I'd love that. So with that, I think, David, do you want to talk about 2FA and how it addresses many parts of the threat landscape that are the less sexy parts, perhaps, that people don't think about?
I think something I want to make super clear is, we can't. There is definitely a need, an important concern on protecting yourself from your own government, but when its capabilities are as advanced as ours, and it's something to think about that, you're not going to be able to learn how to totally evade the NSA within the course of this session. It's just not. Anybody that promises you, learn how to be Snowden in 24 hours is lying to you. And we're not saying that. We're basically wanting to do what we can in the time that we have to cover as much ground as possible, because the threats are not limited to your own government. And the interest in what you're doing isn't necessarily limited to the fact that there is interest to begin with. So Have any of you heard of two-factor authentication? Okay, excellent. So that's a really good thing. How many of you use two-factor authentication? Cool. Okay. So that is really, really, really effective at stopping a lot of the kind of attacks that involve like a fake login page. Just to kind of boil down what two-factor authentication is, there's, in the name, two factors for authentication. Authentication being like logging onto a website, logging onto a lab, logging onto different services that you use. Your first factor is your password. So that's, that's something that you set up. It's something that you know. It like lives in your brain or lives in a password manager, which is also another thing to look into. But then, if you accidentally give your password to, a fake login page, a phishing page, then an attacker has your username and password, they can log in as you. And that's a huge problem, and that's the way that a lot of huge news-breaking attacks have been kind of made. And if you have, however, two-factor authentication turned on, then after you enter your password, you actually have a second thing that you look at that you're like, enter in a 6-digit code or whatever digit code, and that gets sent to you through something separate from the computer that you're on. So, it can come in as a text message to your cell phone or as an application, an app that you use that generates the code using math, not the internet. That's just internal and only lives on the device. Or the thing that we recommend to journalists is using a hardware token where like the immutability of the laws of physics makes it so that this can't be hacked. Well, I will never say that nothing can't be hacked, but the code that generates codes is etched into silicon. So it's one of those things where there's a certain advantage to that. So we recommend these a lot, and in particular and feel free to shop around for whatever kind of thing you want. I would love to see actually an open hardware alternative for any developers listening.
What do you connect that to?
So it could be, this is a USB connection, so it'll connect to USB, but there are ones that connect to the newer USB-C connectors, and there's one that Ubico, this company, makes.
Encryption or password protection too, so somebody could
Yeah.
just physically overtake you.
Sort of. It's not super strong because this has a very, very tiny computer in it,
Sure.
and because of that, it's not very powerful.
Right.
So it can't handle long, strong passwords.
just doing
But there's
business
a PIN
assessment,
code. Basically, if you lose one of these, you should consider it compromised, generate new 2FA setups and get a new key. But yeah, so this is kind of the best way to go for services that support it. Unfortunately, not all of them do. And not all services necessarily support 2FA, but you can compare different, things that are out there to see who supports it, who doesn't. There's a website for that.
While David's writing that down, I'll just note that the choice of your second factor can matter.
Okay.
For instance, he mentioned the 6-digit code that you might get delivered to you, for instance, over your email account or through a text message. If your threat vector is intra-family and the person you're trying to keep your information safe from has access to your cell phone, you probably don't want your second factor being delivered to you by a text message, right? So you have to think about your threat vector when you construct your second factor to fit within your particular situation. This is one reason why there's no silver bullet. You have to construct your silver bullet. Did that make sense to people? Yeah. Okay.
Also, another thing to think in mind, kind of not related to security, but just the practical concerns of having an extra thing to carry with you. The question to ask yourself, do I lose my phone more often than I lose my keys?
Right.
That's, it seems, it's just something to think about as well. And if you can't legally own a ferret in New York City, but if any of you is visiting from outside of New York City and has ferrets, they really love getting the keys and getting into your stuff. So that's another thing to think about if you have ferrets.
That could be one of your
I'd never heard that.
adversaries.
Ferrets
Yeah.
Okay, right.
It's not just the NSA out to get your crypto.
Magpies in mammal form.
Nice. All right, so questions on two-factor authentication? Maybe just to drill down on this, one way you can use it for any one of your various services. Does anybody here use a web-based email program? So most of the large alternatives make available a two-factor, a second factor in your settings options under your privacy settings, if you so choose. Your bank, does anybody do online banking?
Sure.
Your bank will usually provide
The multi.
a second factor option. Same thing with credit card accounts. So you might need to go to each of your various services to set up the second factor authentication on that service, but that's time well spent. Particularly because, and this is just to go back to something, I think this has all been noted, but just to make all this clear, maybe half an hour ago, David mentioned that phishing attacks are one of the primary ways that the prolific hacks have happened, and that two-factor authentication can be a remedy against that. That will address many of the different threat vectors that we've described. And you might think about this as prophylaxis, setting up those steps in advance to make your life easier later. Go ahead.
And the other thing is, notice that the URL was first HTTP and now it's HTTPS.
Nice.
That makes a huge difference.
It does. Let's talk about that.
Yes.
HTTPS, does anybody know what the S stands for? Right. So when you think about authentication, this is the principle that you introduced just a little while ago. HTTPS means that you have a secure connection with the website that you're visiting. Now, to put that in the language of the threat vectors you might be exposed to, if you don't have an HTTPS connection, let's say you're using, who here uses Wi-Fi in a public cafe?
Or library.
Yeah, any of those sort of like public open
So if
Wi-Fi.
you go to the last two websites there,
Uh-huh.
the communication is not encrypted. So anyone can see which web pages you're seeing on those sites.
Yep.
They can see anything that you're typing into a form. Any passwords you type in, anyone can sniff. So you should not use those last two websites
These
until
two?
they're changed.
I'll talk to them. They'll change it this week. I didn't realize that. I'll talk to
Use
them though.
Tor.
But yeah, that's a good point.
No, even if you use Tor.
Or a
they can
VPN.
still see what you're doing.
Yeah, he's right. So
Yeah.
this is an issue with the magic bullet people. I think a lot of people have internalized Tor and Signal as the magic bullets, and like they're really powerful tools, but there are a lot of things they're not going to fix, and this is one of them. Another way to think about this is, well, I'll introduce HTTPS everywhere. That makes sense. So there's a tool that my colleagues at EFF developed. It's a browser plugin. Free both in the sense of you don't have to pay for it, and free in the sense that you can look at the code to confirm that it does what we say it does. And it will basically, when you install it on your browser, it will ensure that your browser will default to the most secure connection available. If the website that you're visiting has a secure connection available, it will ensure that you connect through an HTTPS connection, not the less secure alternative. Does anybody here host websites? Run your own service? I see a few. So for those of you who are hosting websites, I just want to shout out Let's Encrypt and CertBot. These are tools that can enable your site to provide a secure connection to your site visitors. So feel free to share
I would
those.
say, and that's my guess on why these two are not using HTTPS, because they're old enough that they were before Let's Encrypt was allowing for free certificates.
Yep.
And so that's probably why they don't. But
And this is a good example at Sela. Maybe a little while ago you were asking about the future threats. That's a perfect example. When mutantlegal.info was created in the arms race, the folks on our side hadn't yet developed the kinds of tools that hosts can now use to lock down their sites and provide secure connections to their visitors. Similarly, the tools that visitors can use to ensure secure connections with those sites, none of that stuff was available yet. So there's always sort of this effort of needing to backfill the sort of updated security measures to digital properties that preceded them. Let me just come here and then here. Go ahead.
What was the name of that browser plugin?
HTTPS everywhere. Yep.
That one's also an EFF project, if I recall right.
Yeah, it is.
But all this still requires work. Even if you go into HTTPS, you have to take a look at the little lock and see that it matches what you think it is, and you shouldn't assume that's going to protect against the NSA. But it is going to protect
or a phishing attack.
And just to be clear too, if you're using HTTP, if you're connecting to a site that's HTTPS, your web service provider, unless you're using a VPN, is still going to be able to see that you're connecting to that page. Yeah. It's just the actual content between you and that page that will then be encrypted.
So the metadata is still clear.
What's that?
The metadata is still
exactly.
Which is to say,
sure. Yeah. The URLs.
No, is there no way to spoof that, or no?
That's where Tor would come in.
Okay.
Yeah. Tor or VPN or
Okay, so that's two-factor authentication. Another piece of prophylaxis I want to offer people is password managers. Now, you've all heard about a prolific hack of one sort. We talked about the OPM hack. We talked about, I don't know if the Yahoo hack came up, but routinely major services are compromised. And when that happens, among the things that sometimes gets released onto the private market, I think you were the one maybe who had suggested that some of this information is for sale or even available for free. User account data ends up becoming available either to malicious hackers or even publicly. What that means is if you use the same password across lots of different services, who here does that? Be honest, right? Okay, sure. If you do that, you're creating a potential vulnerability. So one way to guard against the potential impact of inevitable hacks to mitigate your future risk is to use different, unique, strong passwords for each of your different profiles. Well, how on earth do you do that? There's an app for that. Did you want something you want to contribute?
What I was going to say is you shouldn't have unique passwords for everything. You should put as much effort into choosing the password as the importance of the information.
That's generally right, though I would push back, and password managers are a way to solve that conundrum, I think.
But you know, if you go into some website that you don't care about,
it's fine to have a throwaway password, right?
If it's life and death information, you should have been really hard about it.
The nice thing about a password manager, though, is it makes it simple enough. You press a button, you've got you say how many characters you want your passwords to be. It takes you all of a second to create a strong, unique password for that site, and that's going to stop you from even this year, people's iClouds. There was a hacking group in London that threatened Apple that if they didn't pay a ransom, they were going to dismantle people's iCloud accounts. They had it broken into Apple. Apple had great security. What they did was years ago LinkedIn was hacked, right? Years ago Dropbox was hacked. Years ago Spotify was hacked, and they were able to retrieve those passwords and try them against people's iCloud accounts. And enough people were using the same password even years later that they were able to get actual access to enough people's accounts to make it an actual viable threat. Right? If you're using a password manager, that would have never worked because each person's individual, that password would have not worked anywhere else. Do we have a question over here?
Yeah, one thing that I saw somewhere and I wanted to ask if it was actually secure is having a really long kind of base around which you make all your different account passwords. So one thing might be this is a red table or something, and then around it you could put F and then Facebook at the end of it, and you can change that per platform. And from what I understand, if your passwords come out, they're going to kind of have an automated way to just sort of check it against all different platforms. I presume that people wouldn't nobody is actually looking at the entire stash of passwords and being oh, I see the pattern here.
Yeah, it's
well, not a human. So before I worked for the Freedom of the Press Foundation, I worked for an artificial intelligence lab. That's coming up. So just a heads up on that.
So that's not entirely secure, but the first part of what you described, I would absolutely raise as a strong security practice, which is to say long strings of words. So a couple things. A, passwords are passé, and you don't want passwords even, you want passphrases. Much higher entropy in a series of words. Now, if the words have associations to you, if it's meaningful, it's probably not a strong password because it can be inferred, guessed. The randomer the set of words, the better. There's a method that's out there. Diceware is the way this is described. You take a list of, and we have one available, a lot of words. You roll dice to then randomly pick words out of the list, and then you have a passphrase. There are other ways to do this, but the key here is the inclusion of spaces and the inclusion of a phrase that you can commit to memory that would be essentially, people have seen Lord of the Rings, the one ring to rule them all. You want a password to get you into a password manager. My password manager includes everything from my banking account information to even stuff that isn't online login information. You can use password managers to do a lot of things. And you could pull out my fingernails and I could not give you my password for most of the services I use because I don't have any idea what they are. I don't need to know what they are. I just know my passphrase to get me to the rest of them. Two concepts to note here. The strongest available security for password managers would be in software that lives on your device, unless, going to David's question, you lose your devices with some degree of frequency, right? So this is another area where your threat model determines which tool you might use. There are web-based password managers that would enable, for instance, access across different devices, but they do carry the theoretical risk that they, like anything on the web might be potentially compromised. So a local password manager would be your strongest secure alternative. And I don't know if you've made this explicit yet, security often comes at a cost. Usually that cost is convenience. Sometimes it can be money, but at least through the free and open software tools, those don't cost money to use, but they can cost time and inconvenience. So you might think in any given setting, your question before you is, how much inconvenience need you tolerate in order to keep safe your asset from your likely threats? And then these are a bunch of tools that, again, that you can choose from. A web-based password manager offers a significant amount of security with fairly significant convenience. A local password manager offers maximal security with slight inconvenience, particularly because I can't use my password manager across devices, right? It also, if you use a local password manager, data backups become very, very important. Because if you don't back up your password manager and your device falls in a toilet, you are hosed. All of your security measures, you have basically pit against yourself. So that's an important piece here, is to make sure that you stay on your side of the security fence. Data backups are really, really powerful.
Fire.
Yeah.
You have some suggestions of password managers?
I use KeePassX. That's a resident local password manager.
Everything.
Well, it works
Yeah.
on
You have a
everything.
web-based one?
And the cool thing is you
Some
can take
people
the
will use
database and
LastPass,
upload it to
OnePass.
the
Those are two
places
different
you want.
alternatives.
LASTPASS.
Just
Yeah.
like that.
I believe OnePass was hacked this week.
One
Is that right?
login.
Really?
One login was hacked this week. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mm.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Other questions or things to add on password managers?
A thing to note about LastPass and kind of the ones that use a web interface is that they kind of have this kind of split of like, here's like, the software that runs on your machine that's generating all the secret stuff versus like the blob that can't be read on their servers that lets you share it across different devices. That makes it so that even though like it's on the web technically, it's a little more secure. There's a lot of nuances to these kind of architectures, so it's something that's like worth looking into. But we do use kind of have LastPass as a recommendation for like large newsrooms that have to share passwords across different groups and things.
That's the nice thing about LastPass too, is that you can share your password with someone without actually giving them your password. Like so they'll be able to like copy it into whatever site that they're on, but they won't actually know. You can set it so they don't actually know the password, which is a cool feature, I think.
You've used the phrase threat model. I'm not sure. It might be good to explain that because people will see that a lot.
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of definitely let us know if we're using any jargon that we haven't taken into account of explaining. I think there's a lot of definitions of what threat modeling is, but in our case, it's basically a series of questions that we ask ourselves to like figure out like what we need to think about when it comes to assessing security solutions and other things that we want to do to protect ourselves.
So you might think of it as a risk assessment. People have done risk assessments in different contexts, right? This is military jargon for a cybersecurity risk assessment.
And this is generally the way that I would like lay it out for if I was doing like a surveillance 101 training. Like what is the things that I want to protect? Who do I want to protect them from? Right. So who are my potential adversaries? And like we said, they could be anywhere from someone in your family to a state actor to a hacker, identity thief. What would be the worst possible thing that happened if I got them, right? So you were doing a threat model before. You were saying I'm not going to use different passwords because I'm going to use this on sites that I'm not worried about what happened. That would that is a threat modeling activity, right? What are they willing to do or likely to do to get it? So like going back to Shahid's, there's no perfect answer, and it's always going to be a battle between convenience and possibly cost versus the level of protection. So depending on what would happen if they got it and what they're likely to do, that's going to determine like how much inconvenience or potential cost I'm going to take on to prevent that thing, right? And which is the last piece, like what am I actually willing to do to stop it? If I'm not that concerned, I might use that password again in multiple places, right? But if I have larger levels of concern and I'm more concerned about what would be the thing that happened if they got it, that might have an effect on what I'm willing to do to stop it, right? So that's the basic threat modeling exercise maybe.
I'm going to shout out a tool without digging into it because I want to move into offense now. We have about 25 minutes left together. We've talked a fair amount about digital defense, but I want to do what we can to position you to fight back against some of these surveillance policies to diminish the threat landscape, right? But I'll just say that there are a number of secure text and voice tools out there. Signal is one that you might have heard. Is who in the room is using Signal now? Who is not? If you've never heard the word, okay, so check out Signal by Open Whisper Systems.
And you only use Signal if the person to whom you're communicating also uses it?
That's right. If you try to message someone who doesn't, it will invite them to install the app.
You can still use it.
Yes.
Sorry?
You can still use it,
It just
it's
won't
just
be
not
secure.
performing.
Depending if
It ends up being unencrypted.
If you're using an Android device, you can use it with people, but it'll just send regular SMS. If you're using an iOS device, you can't send messages through Signal to someone who doesn't have Signal. Right.
And just to note too, even Signal is not a magic bullet. We've heard reports from mobilizations in the movement for Black Lives, from Standing Rock and other places that law enforcement use of cell site simulators might be interfering with the way people can access the cell towers through which they're able to access online services like Signal. So just realize that even the apps and the tools that you use operate within a context. And because of the multiplicity of vulnerabilities and threat vectors, even the tools that we use rely on the...
Nothing's bulletproof.
Exactly.
They're using fake cell phone what?
Let's move into that. That's perfect. That's a perfect question. Thank you so much for that question. And jump in here any time on stingrays if you guys want. So stingrays, has anybody heard of a stingray?
Yes.
I see some hands. Stingrays were what the first generation of the tool were called that started hitting U.S. streets in 2006 and 2007. These were military-grade spying devices that mimic cell phone towers that enable the user of these devices, usually law enforcement, originally FBI, but increasingly state and local law enforcement. It offers them the opportunity to collect metadata, content, and location information from a device connected to a cell phone tower. That was the early versions of the device. The later versions of the device enable malware, hacking, and denial of service. So they're offensively capable devices as well as surveillance devices. They were used for the first 10 years that they were widely available to law enforcement without warrants, at least thousands of times in New York and Baltimore alone, let alone the rest of the country. In 2015, the Department of Justice under the Obama administration imposed a warrant requirement on the use of these devices to collect location or content or metadata. Only 6 states in the union have equivalent requirements, and only 1 state in the union, Illinois, prohibits the offensive use of cell site simulators. The reason I raise this is they are one of a litany of surveillance platforms used by the state and local police. As Sela asked about 20 minutes ago, what do we do about the future sets of things that emerge? I want to share with you at least two to three different things. So there's a reform model and a set of bills around the country that aim to address that, the future proliferation of surveillance devices and forcing transparency, unlike was the case with stingrays. I want to contrast that with the measure adopted in Illinois, which presents a different way of slicing the apple, and I'm going to contrast each of those with a measure that was just adopted in Providence, Rhode Island 3 days ago that I think is the nation's at least broadest and plausibly the most visionary civil rights and civil liberties policing reform proposal across the country. So let's start with the surveillance transparency model. So Silicon Valley, in the form of a county that encompasses it, Santa Clara County, in 2016, adopted a measure, the first of its kind, that is now before the city councils in Oakland and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and St. Louis, Missouri. This is a bill that would essentially force police that want to buy surveillance equipment to get public approval first. It's that simple, and it's that important. What makes it particularly meaningful is that it's device neutral, meaning that this set of reforms would apply equally to stingrays, things that we know now exist, and whatever is the crazy thing that Atsila appropriately fears emerging in 5 years that we can't currently predict. All of those things would be encompassed within this law that requires in Silicon Valley, when that thing gets developed and the sheriff's department wants it, residents will know. And before the law enforcement is allowed to get that tech, they're going to have to document how much will it cost, does our community need it, and how will privacy be impacted? These are questions that in most places no one ever asks, and certainly never documents. So forcing the paper trail around costs, benefits, does Wichita, Kansas need an aerial surveillance drone? Probably not. These are questions that need to be formalized. This model does that. There is a bill of this sort in New York City that has been introduced. It is a very weak version of that model. It is called the POST Act, Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology. It's co-sponsored by council members Dan Garodnick and Vanessa Gibson. Do support the POST Act and go further. I just want to note that the POST Act in particular does not include the legislative veto that would give the public the right to deny access to the devices. It's only transparency. And with more time, I could dig into some routes around that and why that's the case, and maybe if we have time and questions, we can get there. But I just want to move on from the POST Act to particularly, does it make sense to go to Illinois now? Well, let me just stay in New York. There's another bill in New York that would, for instance, prevent police from lying to suspects to induce their consent to searches that are unwarranted. If you support the POST Act, we would very strongly encourage you to also support the Right to Know Act. If the POST Act is transparency at the policy level, the Right to Know Act is transparency on the street. You, officer who keeps harassing me on my way home from school, what is your badge number? And tell the kid that they have the right to decline the consent to the search. This is a big deal that, and I want to be very explicit here, council members who might want to look like they're taking on the NYPD and gain the political benefit of that position without carrying the heavy lift to actually defend communities against where NYPD abuses show up on the street might support the POST Act and not support the Right to Know Act. Supporting transparency in the abstract and on the ground is important, and we're very concerned at EFF to make sure that resistance to principles in the abstract shows up in reality. So the POST Act and the Right to Know Act are two sides of the transparency coin that we would encourage you to keep sight of here in New York.
I was going to ask, as far as the POST Act, would they also have to account for how they get rid of their technology equipment?
How they dispose of it?
Yeah, how they dispose of it, because I could see where communities that could get permission to do it can dump it off on their adjacent communities who don't want
right.
it.
I suspect
as a
not.
way to try to circumvent.
Yeah, I suspect not. I think the most likely way to lock that down would be to enact equivalent measures in those nearby jurisdictions.
Sure.
And just to unpack that, here in New York, so the POST Act, as we discussed, was fairly limited. The strongest proposed civil rights and civil liberties measure in this surrounding area we think will soon be introduced in Jersey City,
Right.
where we're working with an elected member of the council there to basically remix a bill that synthesizes both the stronger versions of the public process model with what I'm about to share from Illinois, and then even pieces from what I'll share after that from Providence. So
Because I would think you would need a paper trail from the production to the landfill that it ends up in, to make sure.
It's a novel point. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And just to respond within what at least the Silicon Valley measure does do is require an annual audit of use, but it doesn't necessarily track disposal, that's
Sure.
interesting. I'll have to make a note of that. Does anybody else want to say anything on POST or Right to Know or transparency?
I just want to make sure everyone understands what the right to know is, because it's to me it's so basic, it should be. I think the problem is a lot of people assume that it's already the case, and it's not. Right. All the Right to Know Act does is says, so you've all watched TV, right? What happens when someone gets arrested on TV?
Supposedly right.
The cops read the Miranda rights, right? Sure. That does not happen in real life, right? Just so you're aware. I have so many people, when they're arrested, they're like, no, it needs to be thrown out because they never read me my rights. Sorry, homie. It's not getting thrown out. The cops only are required to read you your Miranda rights if you're being held in an in-custody interrogation, right? And what an in-custody interrogation means, that's a little bit arguable. It's largely been held that it's you are in the precinct, you are in a room that is locked, and a detective is asking you questions, right? But anything you say to a cop from the first time you meet them on the street is going to be used against you in a court of law, right? If they have the least opportunity to do it. I see your hand. I'm gonna call you in a minute. So all the Right to Know Act says is that when someone is arrested or when they're in an interaction with the police have the responsibility to tell them that they have the right to remain silent, to tell them that they have the right to an attorney, to inform them of what their rights are in that specific case. And we know that the vast majority of New York City, still to this day, 80% of interactions on a stop and frisk level, stop and frisk is not over, right, are blacks and Latinos, and largely black and Latino youth, right? So that's who's being most largely affected. So like Shahid said, if you have these city council people who are saying that they believe in the civil rights of the citizens of New York City, this should be a no-brainer. It's not taking any power away from anyone. It's, if anything, it's giving power to the people who are least empowered within our communities, right? So, yeah.
Thank you for that.
Of course.
I think ACLU has a lot of resources on what to do if you're stopped by the police. So I think
Awesome.
That's important. Also, I think this ends at 10 at 11:50, not now.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this last thing I'll shout out there is check out the Providence Community Safety Act. Actually, they renamed the bill. I have a blog post at the top of VFF.org about a bill passed in Providence that includes measures to restrict surveillance, not just transparency, but actually measures to restrict its deployment, as well as measures to address profiling, protect undocumented residents, guard the citizen right and civilian right to observe and record police, and provide due process for people included on gang injunctions, all in a single measure. One way you might respond to that is the next time you see a bill like the Post Act that is very narrowly carved and targeted at a single problem, you might ask your council person why they won't meet your community's needs in any of the other places where they emerge. The idea that you have to carve single pieces of legislation to address single needs and divide communities instead of expansive measures that unite them, that is a vital methodological question on which most of our institutional allies, quite frankly, are still in the 19th century. Like, expansive measures that focus fire across different communities, that is how we secure civil rights and civil liberties in the future. And stay tuned for more information. If you're interested in learning more, please come talk to us. I have some sign-up sheets, and I'm happy to send you information from EFF. I suspect Freedom of the Press and Black Movement Law Project would like to do the same. I want to thank our videographers for joining us and each of you for being here.
Thank you.